Hi class, today we're going to be talking about chapter 4, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and then the first section of that chapter, Making Mummies from Story of the World. In this video, we will be reviewing chapter 4, discussing the First Dynasty of Egypt, the Second Dynasty of Egypt, and making mummies. And we're going to start with review. So King Narmer united Egypt, like you learned about previous video, and he kind of ushered in an age that we call the Old Kingdom of Egypt. During this time, Egypt was very rich and powerful. This period lasted about 1,000 years, from 3000 to 21 BC. During this time, the Egyptians embalmed and preserved bodies, specifically pharaohs and higher up officials' bodies, which was a process that we call mummification. So to kind of get an idea of the timeline that we're going to be looking at, I want you to look at this first dot right here. So we discussed pre-dynastic Egypt, and we said it's prehistory. We're not going to really talk about it. And then we discussed how King Narmer united Egypt, and this begins the First Dynasty of Egypt. As you can see here, we have the Second Dynasty, the Third Dynasty, and the Fourth Dynasty of Egypt. When the Third Dynasty of Egypt begins, that's when we have the Old Kingdom of Egypt beginning. So I want you to think about this, because it can kind of get confusing, as the kingdoms being books in a series, like Lord of the Rings or something like that. So you have the kingdoms, the Old Kingdom of Egypt being the first book in the series, and then the dynasties that fall under it as the chapters in that book. Unfortunately, the First Dynasty and the Second Dynasty didn't really make the cut, so just think of those as like a little prequel novella to Egyptian history. If you want to learn more about why and how Egypt is dated, or Egyptian history is dated this way, watch a video called Ancient Egyptian History and Chronology by Voices of Ancient Egypt on YouTube. I know it sounds really boring to study why something is the way it is, or why things are dated the way it is, but it's actually really fascinating. This video is an animation, so go and watch it if you have time. We're going to start by talking about the First Dynasty of Egypt, which was from 3100 to 2890 BC. The First Dynasty of Egypt, again, review, Narmer unites Egypt, pre-dynastic Egypt ends, and around 3000 BC, Egypt is the only nation in the entire world. So in Mesopotamia, in Sumer, we have cities being ruled by a king, but we don't have a lot of cities being ruled by one leader like we do in Egypt anywhere else in the world. The capital of Egypt during this time is Memphis, and they were 8 kings that ruled during the First Dynasty. So during the First Dynasty, we don't know a lot about this time period, but we do know that Egypt's government grew. We have a royal court, we have people paying taxes, and the economy is growing because people can do things other than make food, because again, we talked about the agricultural revolution and how that created a surplus. So you can have priests, you can have jewelry makers, etc. So one of the interesting characteristics of the First Dynasty of Egypt is how they buried their pharaohs. So during this time, they believed that the king would join the sun on a passage across the sky. And we know this because there have been wooden boats found in burial chambers ready to embark on this journey. There are also drawings like the one I put here of the sun god traveling. And the reason for this was that a pharaoh could continue his royal role in the underworld. Another characteristic of burials was human sacrifice. And I find this completely appalling, but also fascinating to an extent, that the pharaohs were buried with attendants. The third king of Egypt was buried with 200 attendants. The fifth king of Egypt was buried with 300 attendants. And I want you to ask yourself, what would you have to do in order to compel that kind of allegiance? Understand that these pharaohs, like Den, weren't going around saying, hey, who died or I guess not him because he would be dead, but whoever his officials were, they weren't going around collecting bodies of dead people. They were getting their attendants to come and be buried, be killed, to be buried with the pharaoh. So what did people have to believe about a pharaoh in order to follow him into death? And I'm going to answer that question by telling you about the Memphite theology. This was a very important belief in ancient Egypt. So you studied this a little bit before, but Osiris was said to rule the entire earth. His brother Set is very jealous of his brother, and so he drowns Osiris in the Nile. Isis, who is Osiris and Set's sister, also Osiris's wife, hunts for the body. Isis half resurrects Osiris enough to where he has enough energy to impregnate her. Then he dies, and Osiris becomes the king of the underworld, which is where the Egyptians believe they went after they died. Horus, his son, becomes king of the living world. So you have Horus ruling the living world, Osiris ruling the underworld. Now, when a pharaoh became king, he claimed to be Horus. He claimed to be the god who ruled the living. He was no longer a man, he was a god. However, even pharaohs die. And if you die, what would make someone want to or be okay with dying with you? So the pharaohs began claiming that when they die, they go to the underworld and they become Osiris. So now you are king of the underworld. You're also father to Horus, who is ruling Egypt currently. So the new pharaoh was, in a sense, a reincarnation of the previous pharaoh. It was like the pharaohs just were Osiris and Horus and Osiris and Horus in a kind of sense. And in this way, a pharaoh never died. And they made people believe that they had this immortality about them. Okay, so keep that in mind as we discuss, or as we keep discussing. So the end of the First Dynasty happened when Samarkand decided he was going to chip away the previous king's name for the monument. Samarkand was the last king of the First Dynasty. So he chips away the king's name from the monument. And remember when we talked about Egyptian hieroglyphics, that they believed writing brought power, brought life, brought immortality, and to deface their monuments, to take away their names, was essentially almost killing them. And so it showed weakness on these pharaohs' part. These pharaohs who were supposedly in the underworld claiming to be Osiris, and they couldn't even protect their name. So this kind of started to show that maybe if the pharaoh isn't quite who they say they are, maybe they aren't quite as powerful as they want you to believe. Samarkand built, it's just an interesting fact, he built a huge tomb for himself, and he poured so much oil, or had so much oil poured into the tomb. It went 3 feet down, and when it was discovered in the 1900s and it was opened up and excavated, you could still smell the fragrant oil, which I think is ridiculous. Anyway, during this time, one of the reasons the First Dynasty ended was because the Nile floods decreased significantly, and scientists believe that this was due to some kind of climate change that happened. Remember, we discussed how the Nile River flooded every year, and this made this made Egypt very fertile. And so when these floods decreased, obviously that's not going to be good for farming and for planting. And so during this time, sacrificial burials stopped. Or I'm sorry, after this time, after the First Dynasty, sacrificial burials stopped. And I want you to be thinking about why that might be as we get into our discussion of the Second Dynasty of Egypt, which was from 2890 to 2696 BC. So as we start the Second Dynasty of Egypt, the floods are decreasing and there is a drought happening in the land. When this happens, it proves that pharaohs don't have the ability to control the land of the living like they wanted people to believe. Again, maybe the Pharaoh isn't quite as powerful as he wants people to believe. Egypt breaks out into a civil war during the Second Dynasty of Egypt, and it lasts many years until Casichem from the south defeats the north and reunites Egypt again. So the Second Dynasty of Egypt is a little tumultuous. You have drought, you have civil war, and after that is when we begin the Third Dynasty of Egypt, which we will discuss in our next video. But just keep in mind that the Third Dynasty of Egypt begins with reunification. Egypt is very wealthy. You have pyramids, which I'm really excited to talk about with you guys. And this begins the Old Kingdom of Egypt, like we saw in our timeline. Okay, so on to the gross stuff. Mummies. The mummification began around the Second Dynasty of Egypt, even though it was mostly practiced during the Old Kingdom of Egypt, so like Third and Fourth Dynasties. But I want to talk to you about why Egypt felt the need to preserve their bodies to such an extent. And this goes back to their belief system. So again, they believed that death meant you went into the afterlife, and this brought immortal existence. You lived forever, and preserving their physical bodies was a part of this. And the Memphite theology, again, very heavily influenced their worldview, their beliefs. And so in order to understand how the Memphite theology is connected to mummification, I want you to go and watch the ancient Egyptian god Osiris, his story. It's only a few minutes, I think like 5. And again, it's like a little animation, but it does a really great job of explaining how the Memphite theology is connected to mummification and why the Egyptians felt like they needed to preserve bodies. So we're going to do a brief review of making mummies because this really grosses me out, you guys. So here we go. We're going to keep it short. So it said in your book that whoever was preparing the body preserved or prepared salt, spices, oil, linen. They would wash the body, take the organs out, and preserve it. And then they would take the heart back, wash it, put it back in. They would cover the body for 40 days of mourning, and then they would wash the organs and the body again, and they would cover it with more oil, with more spices, and then they would put the organs in canopic jars. Then they would cover the body with linens and jewelry, put a gold mask on. They would have a whole ceremony, put it in the coffin, and then they would bring it to the tomb or pyramid or whatever it was. They would place it in a sarcophagus, which is the burial chamber, and then they would fill the sarcophagus with many things that they believed the pharaohs needed for their afterlife. Here's a picture of canopic jars. And if you want more info about mummies, because I really didn't want to get into discussing all of the grotesque details with you guys, I watched videos about it and I'm linking them below. And these videos are in order from least detailed and grotesque to most detailed and grotesque. So pick the video that fits within your tolerance level for these kinds of things. Watch it, and I will see you next time. Bye.